Hey guys, and welcome to another episode here on the Null channel. This one is for all of you who might be new to Kubernetes release notes. I wanted to make this so that everyone had a decent starting point when they watched the release notes. They could understand the terminology without repeating myself every single time that I did Kubernetes release notes. So if you're new to Kubernetes release notes, if you're new to Kubernetes, here's a little introduction to Kubernetes jargon that might be really helpful to understand when understanding these release notes and what we mean by certain things. When we're trying to understand Kubernetes releases, it's really important to understand what the community means by certain things when they use things like the term beta. And just a little background on how all of these things work, like what is the difference between alpha, beta, and general availability, or shortened to GA most of the time? What are deprecation standards, and how long do you have before a deprecated feature gets removed from Kubernetes? And then there's things like version skew policies and what are SIGs, and each release note gets tied to a SIG. And is all of these things the same across all the SIGs, or do they change? Let's start at the very beginning. Kubernetes releases follow something called semantic versioning, meaning they express in a 3-digit expressions that stand for the major, minor, and patch version of the project. 3 times a year, a minor version is released. A patch version is created anytime a security or major bugs are fixed on a timely schedule. To my understandings, the major version, Kubernetes 2.0, will probably be an entirely different project. Kubernetes itself maintains the last 3 minor versions. This means that you get around a year of patch support for a specific Kubernetes version from the upstream Kubernetes project. Now, your vendor could provide patch support for older versions, but that would be vendor specific. When talking about version skew, it's important to understand that everything is based on the version of the Kubernetes API server that you are running. The Kubernetes API instance must be within one instance of each other. Though they should actually match perfectly, this is really just useful for upgrading scenarios. The Cubelet, on the other hand, can be up to 2 minor releases behind the API server. It cannot be ahead. For example, if your Kube API server is at 1.22, then the Cubelet can be 1.22, 1.21, or 1.20, but it cannot be 1.23. In general, everything that runs on the Kubernetes control plane is expected to match in version, but a single older version is allowed for live updating of the cluster. So as you update the cluster, usually you update one at a time and update it to the next version. kubectl has a single version skew, but it is allowed to be both older and newer, meaning if your Kubernetes API server is version 1.22, then a kubectl of 1.23, 1.22, and 1.21 would all work. Okay, so that is probably enough about versions. Let's go ahead and talk about API stability. This exists in 3 major forms: alpha, beta, and GA, or general availability. This can also be called stable. And what exactly does this mean to this community? Well, while each SIG is different, there are some general guidelines all of these projects should strive to abide by, and for the most part, do a very good job of being consistent across the entire Kubernetes ecosystem. Alpha. In general, this means the maintainers of the project API or feature don't think it's mature enough to be used in production and is disabled by default. This also has to be exposed by using a feature flag if you did want to use it. I generally find that things in alpha are also a little bit less well tested than some of the other things and are more apt to change their API because of some things that they have learned during the alpha phase. Here is the official guidance on alpha. The version name contains the word alpha. The software may contain bugs. I honestly think this should be removed from the definition of alpha, as this kind of implies the rest of the software does not have bugs. I think it's there for a warning for people who might be wanting to use it, but the rest of the software still has bugs. Anyhow, it also means support and the feature as a whole could be dropped in the future with absolutely no notice. And there are no guarantees given for future backwards compatibility, so there might be breaking changes. Let's move on to beta. In general, beta means that the maintainers of the project, API, or feature think that this is safe to use and pretty well tested. This means they are not protected behind a feature gate and are enabled by default. While there will be future support, it is not guaranteed that the schema will not change, but migration steps will be provided if they are needed in a beta migration. I find beta to be one of those weird spots because it's recommended people don't use them. But at the same time, it's recommended people use them because it's the final chance to make any major changes to it before it goes stable. Because once it's unstable, it is much harder to change and usually requires a entire version change to do so. In general, I see many people run with beta features even in production, and these projects and APIs are generally pretty well tested as well documented. Something to note here, just recently, per the official guidelines, a project has only 3 releases in beta before it has to go stable. If it does not go stable within those 3 releases, it will be deprecated and removed from the project. This is to encourage people to ensure their project is good to go before exiting alpha, and really just on the final leg before going GA, and kind of there to encourage people to get over that final hump of finishing the project. The first 80% is the easiest part, the last 20% is the hardest and least rewarding. All right, and lastly, we have the boring stable or GA. This just really means it's considered 100% ready to go, and I guess if you're taking the previous statements, it's completely bug-free. But while we're talking about versions, what is Kubernetes deprecation policy? I mean, if something was to be removed, how would it be done? Well, thankfully, the Kubernetes project has done a fantastic job of creating an excellent deprecation policy that follows a few basic rules. Now, there are actually a bunch more rules, but I'm just going to cover the first basic ones that give you a good general idea of what they are. Rule number 1. API elements may only be removed by incrementing the version of the API group. This just means you have to create a new version before you can deprecate the old version. Makes sense. Rule number 2, API objects must be able to round trip between API versions in a given release without information loss, with the exception of whole REST resources that do not exist in some versions. This just means you can go back and forth between them and not actually lose information. Makes sense again. Pretty simple. Rule number 3, an API version in a given track may not be deprecated until a new API version, at least as stable, is released. Now, this is a little bit more confusing and sounds kind of like rule 1. Okay, so for a quick example, a GA or stable API version can replace either GA versions, beta, or alpha versions. Beta API versions cannot replace GA versions, though. And alpha versions can only replace other alpha versions. So there's no way to, you can't release an alpha version that replaces a beta version. Rule number 4A. Other than the most recent API versions in each track, older API versions must support, after their announced deprecation, for a duration of no less than, and this is where it gets a little tricky, if it's GA or stable, 12 months or 3 releases, whichever is longer. This is roughly equivalent though, so it doesn't really matter. Beta, 9 months, or 3 releases, which means it will be 3 releases because that's 12 months, which it doesn't really make sense as to why they would state that. Or an alpha is 0 releases. Again, alpha has really no guarantees of future or backwards compatibility. Now, there is a lot more information on deprecation, so if you're interested in the deprecation, there'll be a link below for more information on deprecation policies in Kubernetes. And there are a bunch more rules. I think it goes up to 8 or 9. For brevity, I just giving you the link and letting you dig into that more, but they follow all the same standards that you're seeing here. GA and stable have longer deprecation policies than beta, and for the most part, alpha has no guarantees at all. The very last thing that you guys, I really want you to understand is that Kubernetes is massive. And there are a lot of teams that work on a ton of different aspects of the projects. And these teams for larger groups or collectives called SIGs, or special interest groups. These special interest groups manage and control a specific area and a specific portion of the project. For example, SIG Cluster Lifecycle manages the application called KubeADM. That's their baby. I only really bring this up because while the CNCF and Kubernetes as a whole gives a lot of guidance, and all of these SIGs hold very well to that guidance, each SIG is slightly different, and it's good to understand the SIG you're interested in. There's SIG nodes, SIG API machinery. All of these look at and try to manage a single aspect of Kubernetes. That is all of the major things that you need to understand when talking about Kubernetes releases, and all of the terms I'm probably going to throw around when talking about the release notes. Now, don't worry. I have left a ton of links on each of the topics talked about. So if you're a little bit confused about any one of these, please go to those links and see if doing a little bit of reading helps you a little bit. My hope is that you are now empowered to understand Kubernetes releases just a little bit better. And hopefully we can bring you a lot of great content on Kubernetes releases. All right, that's it for me today. I hope that you like this. If you did, please like and subscribe. If you did not, I'm going to have to ask you to please go ahead, hit that subscribe button, stick around, see if these videos get any better for science.